For years, Tim Allen stood at the center of a sitcom that looked stable on the surface, a familiar father navigating life with his wife and 3 daughters. But behind that consistency, something unusual kept happening. Characters disappeared, faces changed, and storylines quietly shifted without clear explanations. Viewers noticed, but the real reasons were rarely explained on screen. And once you look closely at what was happening behind the scenes, it becomes clear this wasn't random at all. The first crack, when stability started to slip. At the beginning, Last Man Standing was designed to feel predictable in the best way. The structure was simple and reliable. Mike Baxter, played by Tim Allen, dealing with a house full of strong personalities while escaping to the controlled environment of Outdoor Man, where he could express his worldview through work and his video blog. The dynamic worked because every character had a clear role. Kristen was the young mother trying to find her footing. Mandy was a carefree and often self-absorbed middle child, and Eve was the sharp, observant daughter who aligned most closely with her father's values. The balance between them created tension, humor, and continuity. But that balance did not last long. The first major disruption came quietly, and if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed how significant it actually was. Kristen Baxter, originally played by Alexander Krosny, was suddenly recast after the first season. The official explanation given was creative reasons, which is a phrase often used in television when producers want to change direction without revealing too much. But in this case, the shift was not subtle. Amanda Fuller stepped into the role with a noticeably different presence. The character became more grounded, more serious, and more aligned with the tone the writers wanted moving forward. This wasn't just about acting style. It reflected a deeper adjustment in how the show wanted to portray family dynamics. Kristen was no longer just a young woman figuring things out. She became someone shaped by responsibility, someone who had to carry emotional weight that required a different kind of performance. And the show made a clear decision to prioritize that shift over continuity. At the same time, another smaller but equally telling change was happening with Boyd, Kristen's son. The role had already been played by twins in the early episodes, which is common for child characters. But as the show progressed, the character was recast again and then again later. By the time the series continued beyond its original run, Boyd had been portrayed by multiple actors, each one slightly older, slightly different in tone, and increasingly aligned with more complex storylines. What this revealed was something important. Last Man Standing was not committed to preserving its original cast at all costs. Instead, it was willing to reshape its characters to fit evolving narrative goals. That decision may have helped the show adapt, but it also created a pattern. Once one major character could be replaced, it became easier to justify doing it again. And that pattern would only become more obvious as the show moved forward. The revival that changed everything. When the show was suddenly canceled, it looked like a typical network decision. Ratings were still solid, the audience was loyal, and Tim Allen remained a recognizable face on television. But the cancellation created something far more disruptive than a normal ending. It broke the continuity of the cast at the exact moment when many of the actors were starting to move forward with their careers. That gap between cancellation and revival became the turning point. When the series was picked up again by a different network, the expectation from viewers was simple. They wanted the same family back, the same faces, the same chemistry that had been built over years. But behind the scenes, that was no longer possible. During the time the show was off the air, several actors had already committed to new projects. Contracts had been signed, schedules had been filled, and priorities had shifted. The most noticeable example of this was Mandy Baxter. Molly Ephraim had played the character for multiple seasons, and her version of Mandy was well-defined. She brought a specific rhythm to the role, balancing humor with a slightly exaggerated personality that still felt grounded in the family dynamic. But when the show returned, she did not come back. The reason was not conflict. It was timing. By the time production resumed, Ephraim had already moved on to other acting commitments. That left the producers with a decision. Either remove Mandy entirely or recast her. They chose to recast, bringing in Molly McCook, and that decision immediately changed the tone of the character. McCook's version of Mandy was taller, more energetic, and carried a different kind of presence that contrasted sharply with what audiences were used to. The reaction was immediate and intense. Viewers were not just reacting to a different actress. They were reacting to a disruption in familiarity. Sitcom audiences build long-term attachments to characters, and when a face changes, it can feel like the character itself has been replaced. The producers were fully aware this would happen. They expected the backlash, but they also believed that casting the strongest available actress was more important than maintaining visual continuity. At the same time, this wasn't the only change triggered by the revival. Ryan Vogelson, the father of Boyd, had originally been played by Nick Jonas in an early appearance. But when the character became more central to the story, the role was recast with Jordan Masterson. The shift allowed the show to develop Ryan as a more stable, long-term presence, especially in his relationship with Kristen and his role as a father. Even smaller characters were affected. Carol Larrabee, Chuck's wife, returned later in the series with a different actress, creating another subtle but noticeable shift for attentive viewers. What made this period different from earlier changes was scale. This was no longer one or two adjustments. It was a series of decisions made in a short span of time, all driven by the same reality. The show had been paused, and during that pause, the cast had moved on. From that point forward, Last Man Standing was no longer trying to preserve what it once was. It was trying to rebuild itself with whoever was available. The quiet exit, that meant more than it looked. Not every departure on Last Man Standing came with a visible replacement or a dramatic reaction from the audience. Some of the most important changes happened in a much quieter way, and one of the clearest examples of that was Eve Baxter. From the very beginning, Eve was not just another member of the family. She was the one who connected most directly with Mike Baxter. While the rest of the household often challenged or balanced his perspective, Eve understood it. She shared his interest in discipline, structure, and eventually the military. That alignment made her role essential not just in terms of storylines, but in maintaining the emotional core of the show. So when her presence started to decrease, it was noticeable even if the show didn't treat it like a major event. The explanation written into the story was simple. Eve had been accepted into the Air Force Academy, something that had been hinted at through her personality and ambitions. It made sense on paper. It fit her character. It allowed the show to explain her absence without creating conflict or forcing an unnatural exit. But behind that decision was a very real shift. Caitlin Dever's career outside the show had started to grow quickly. She was no longer just a sitcom actress. She was taking on film roles that demanded time, focus, and long production schedules. Projects like Beautiful Boy, Booksmart, and them that follow position her in a completely different space in the industry. These were not small roles. They required full commitment, and that commitment could not exist alongside a full-time network sitcom schedule. The producers did not push her out. In fact, they made it clear they wanted her back whenever possible. But the reality was that her availability had changed. She was working more, traveling more, and becoming a sought-after actress in a way that made consistent appearances on the show difficult. What makes the situation different from other cast changes is the absence of conflict. There was no public disagreement, no reported tension, and no attempt to distance her from the show. In fact, her co-stars spoke openly about supporting her success. Amanda Fuller even described how Dever would reach out when she had free time, ask and come back, and appear in episodes whenever possible. That kind of relationship is rare in long-running shows where cast changes often come with underlying issues. And she did return, even with a demanding film career. Caitlin Dever appeared in several later episodes, including a key moment in the series finale. That detail matters because it shows that her departure was never intended to be permanent. It was flexible, shaped entirely by scheduling rather than any breakdown behind the scenes. But the impact of her reduced presence was still significant. Without Eve as a regular character, the balance inside the Baxter family shifted again. The dynamic between Mike and his daughters changed, and the show had to adjust how it created tension and connection within the household. It was a subtle shift, but it added to the growing pattern. By this point, it was becoming clear that the show was no longer defined by a fixed group of characters. It was adapting constantly, responding to outside pressures that had nothing to do with the story itself. The pattern no one could ignore. By the time the show moved into its later seasons, something had become impossible to overlook. These were no longer isolated changes. They were part of a pattern, one that showed Last Man Standing was constantly adjusting its cast to survive rather than protecting consistency at all costs. And the clearest example of that pattern was Boyd Baxter. On paper, Boyd was just a child character, the son of Kristen and Ryan, but in practice, he became one of the most frequently changed roles in the entire series. The character was first played by twins in early episodes, which is standard in television for practical reasons. Then Flynn Morrison took over and remained in the role for several seasons, giving Boyd a more stable presence during the original network run. But when the show returned after its cancellation, Boyd was recast again, this time with Jet Juergensmeyer. That kind of repeated change is not typical for a sitcom, especially for a character connected directly to the main family. The reasoning was never fully explained on screen, but the direction of the character made the intention clear. As Boyd grew older, the writers began introducing more complex elements into his storyline, including his identity, his relationship with religion, and the influence of different viewpoints within the family. That required a different kind of performance, one that could carry more dialogue and more emotional nuance. The recasting wasn't random. It was tied directly to how the character was evolving. But Boyd's situation also revealed something else. Continuity was no longer the priority. The show had reached a point where maintaining the same face was less important than maintaining the direction of the story. That approach can work, but it comes with a cost. Every time a character changes, the audience has to adjust again. And over time, those adjustments begin to accumulate. It wasn't just Boyd. Kristen had already been replaced earlier in the series. Mandy had been recast after the revival. Ryan had shifted from a guest appearance to a regular role with a different actor. Carol Larrabee had returned with a new face as well. When you step back and look at all of these changes together, it becomes clear just how unusual this was for a long-running sitcom. At one point, the show had replaced 7 actors across its run. That number matters because it shows this wasn't a one-time issue or a temporary disruption. It was a structural part of how the show operated. Each change had its own reason, but collectively they created a cycle where adaptation became normal. And yet the show continued. That's what makes this situation different from many others. Most shows struggle when they lose key cast members. They lose chemistry, lose audience trust, and eventually decline. But Last Man Standing managed to keep going, not by avoiding change, but by embracing it. Still, there was one more layer to this story, something that tied all of these decisions together and explained why the show kept making the same choice again and again. The real reason behind it all. By the end of the series, the question was no longer why one actor left or why a specific character was replaced. The real question was why this kept happening again and again across multiple seasons, across different networks, and across nearly every major character in the show. And the answer comes down to something much simpler than most people expect. Last Man Standing was built to survive, not to stay unchanged. From the outside, it looked like a traditional family sitcom, but behind the scenes, it operated with a very different priority. The show was constantly balancing network expectations, actor availability, and evolving storylines, all while trying to maintain a consistent tone. When those factors came into conflict, consistency was usually the first thing to be sacrificed. The cancellation played a major role in this. When the show was originally taken off the air, it disrupted everything at once. Actors who had been committed to the series suddenly had to make decisions about their careers. Some moved into films like Caitlin Dever, whose schedule became too demanding to return full-time. Others accepted new television roles, making it impossible to come back when the show was revived. By the time production started again, the original cast was no longer fully available, and the show had no choice but to adapt. But even beyond the revival, there was another layer: creative direction. The producers were not trying to preserve every detail exactly as it was. They were actively reshaping the show as it evolved. That's why characters like Kristen were recast early on to better fit a more grounded and mature tone. It's why Mandy was reinterpreted with a different energy after the show returned. It's why Boyd was recast multiple times as his role became more complex. Each decision reflected a willingness to prioritize storytelling over continuity.